Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast, where leadership meets entertainment. In today's episode, we are going to discuss birth order and does it matter? You've heard the stereotypes: firstborn children are spoiled, the middle kids get ignored, and the youngest kids act out because they crave attention. Well, new research shows that birth order really does matter, and we are going to unpack some of that research today. Before that, Ron, I know you conducted training in San Antonio last week, and I saw a stepladder with one person on it, and others appeared to be holding him and the ladder. What was that about?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, Kristin. It was tough to get that stepladder on the plane. No, I did call ahead and said I need a stepladder, so the hotel was happy to oblige, apparently.
Nice.
I use the stepladder to show as people get promoted and you go up different rungs of the ladder, you get a different perspective. And interestingly, I hid something in the room that you could only see when you went up a few rungs of the ladder. So I asked the individual to identify the object, and they did, but then I had them go down a couple of rungs and they couldn't see it anymore. And I was showing as you get higher up, when you get promoted, that your perspective change. You start to deal with personnel and budget and things like that. But you do still have to be aware of the line staff, but the primary responsibility is the senior staff and middle managers. And then, of course, it leads to the crescendo of if everyone is holding on and making sure that that person's safe, we're protecting, supporting one another, but also we're communicating up and down that ladder. And I said an agency that does this cannot fail. The ladder, the wind can blow, the ladder will not fall. And that's the point of the whole thing, is to learn to appreciate the different perspectives as it corresponds with different positions in a company or organization.
Right. Oh, that makes so much sense. I like that a lot, because the first thing that came to mind is the show Undercover Boss. And it did show the higher up they went, a lot of them were the CEOs or CFOs, they became completely disengaged. They didn't intend to, but they had no idea what that, like what you've referred to as the line person or that the front person, retail or whatever. They had no idea what was happening at that level. And so they were making decisions that were not right for the folks that were actually interacting with customers, or at least at that entry level. So yeah, I think that's a great example. And I'm sure you had a lot of people that were having aha moments throughout that.
Yeah, and we had a lot of fun as well. So
yeah, I can imagine.
Good times.
That I like that, because that training, I've been through a lot of corporate training, and that is very different. I love that it's interactive and it just gets people up and moving, and they will actually remember it versus if they just sat there and were told to take notes for 8 hours, right?
That's what we try to do, Kristin.
Love it, Ron. And for those watching, not listening, we are wearing our Dirty Side of Leadership t-shirts. Ron texted me before we recorded. He's like, do you want to wear the t-shirts? And I'm like, yeah. Do you plan on ironing yours before you wear it?
If you didn't admit that, I was gonna rat you out.
Yeah, Big Ron Wrinkle over here posted a t-shirt picture on the Instagram and Facebook stories, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so wrinkly.
This is the truth. We've done this podcast long enough. I read her mind. And I saw the wrinkles and I thought, Kristin's going to die. I posted her artwork, her cricket, and my shirt's wrinkled. And I took a little bit of pleasure in that, Kristin, I have to admit.
I'm sure you did. Oh, my goodness. I was like, oh, my gosh, Ron, when I saw it. But yeah, hey, the good thing is whatever lighting you're in right now, you can't even tell. So
what's this South Carolina humidity? It's the first thing I noticed. You never have to iron anything. You just walk outside.
Hey. All right. So let's discuss birth order and see if it impacts the way we live and the way we approach life. So research shows that birth order has a lot of influence on how we behave in the workplace, whether we like it or not. We unconsciously create a family environment at work. So sometimes it resembles our personal family dynamic, and sometimes it resembles the ideal family dynamic that we never had.
Kristin, I think that's so important, and the research does show that either people bring their dysfunctional family to work, or they have this remember those old shows like Leave It to Beaver? They have those images of how it should be, and both of those can be unhealthy. You can't be unrealistic, but you can't bring it. We talk about a trauma transfer. You can't bring the problems you had in the past into the current situation. So, yeah, that's a great way to look at it. So we're going to look at several studies, and let's be clear, in addition to birth order, there are multiple variables. So I know people listening are going to start saying, yeah, but what about this or that? So some of that's considered. What I think would be a good way to approach this is just to imagine that most people are going to bring 10 or 15% of that into adulthood. And that might be a better way to look at it. But we did consider age span, social status, financial status, single or double parent home. I mean, the list can just go on and on. There's a non-exhaustive list, or these are a non-exhaustive list, but you can get a lot out of this, what we're going to cover. So there was one study that believed birth order had little, if any, influence on behaviors, and they base it on a lot of other factors, but the majority of the research that we did does believe that birth order is very important. Interestingly, Kristin, I interviewed my sister, Becky, for this episode.
I love that.
I thought it would be cool because Becky is 6 years younger than me. But after I interviewed her, and I'm going to go into that, I did look at a study that said if it's more than 5 years, a lot of times the second child just replaces the first child, because the span is so much that they almost feel like they're the only child. Like a lot of times that first child is out of the home, right in their formative years. So the middle child takes some of the characteristics of the first child. But anyway, when I talked to my sister, she took on some of the responsibilities. For example, it said that the firstborn is organized, it works off a list and all these different things, natural leader. Some of that she definitely works off of list. But she did meet a characteristic that we're going to go into. She does not like conflict. She definitely tries to negotiate and get along with people, or if someone else is in conflict, she'll try to bring solace to that situation. And that is one of the characteristics we'll talk about of a middle child. But she said the most difficult part for her, being that much younger than me, is she would watch me like I'm outside riding motorcycles. She said everything she wanted to do, I was doing. And so there was a little bit of animosity in that regard. But her greatest characteristic, I hope she listens to this, is the fact that she's forgiven me. And she treats me really well, because I thought that my goal in life was to torture her and make her miserable.
Wait, so I think I missed something. Are you the oldest?
I'm the
she's
oldest.
the middle, and then
Yes.
you have a younger.
There's no other.
So it's
I was
just
calling
you
it
two siblings. Okay.
Yeah, she's a second, not a middle, I guess you would say.
Right. Okay.
I'm glad you clarified that.
No, I was just curious because same with me. I have just me and my sister. My sister's 5 years younger, so very similar actually. And the dynamic is different, I would say. It's so funny because my husband's a firstborn also, and we're both very domineering, type A, impatient, and go-getters, right? And my sister, she had oral surgery today. Otherwise I would have interviewed her, but I just spent the weekend with her. We went on a road trip. So, but we've had these conversations before, and the dynamic is interesting. She's definitely more, I like to call her artsy fartsy. I don't think she loves that, but she's just artistic and is more in touch with her feelings. And I guess more on the sensitive side, where I was always hurting feelings, I guess, from being insensitive.
Like telling people to iron their shirts. I get it.
It's not intentional, but just very, very different.
So, Kristin, that's interesting because you guys and me and my sister, to some extent, do meet the stereotypical, or at least what some of the studies revealed.
Right.
I find that very interesting.
Yeah. And, you mentioned your sister's like a peacemaker. My sister will do that too. Like my dad and I we have good banter, but I call him out because he needs to be called out. Let me just tell you. But then I notice my sister will go, "Oh, Dad, it's okay,"
Yeah.
and I'm like, "No, he needed to be called out on that because he can act a fool sometimes too, right?" So she definitely wants to make sure she doesn't want waves or any of that within the family. And it is interesting. My parents are divorced, but they are really good friends. So that's another interesting dynamic. But still, she wants everything to be peaceful. And it's not that I don't, but I'm a truth teller. So I don't beat around the bush. So
It's okay, Kristin. You don't have to explain. All right, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So there's that. Yeah. But okay, so I want to talk about this doctor's research. So Dr. Kevin Leman, I don't know if I'm saying that
Yeah,
right, but
I think
his
so.
his research in a book titled The Birth Order Book, pretty straightforward there. He spent over 35 years as a psychologist studying birth order and is a world-renowned expert on the topic. And his book provided insights on how one can predict an individual's birth order, which I think is really interesting. I'm always like trying to figure out what somebody does for a living. My new thing is going to be, I'm going to predict their birth order.
Yep.
So that's a new challenge. But throughout the book, he examines the 4 primary birth positions: firstborn, middle, youngest, and then the only child. And each chapter in the book, it delves deeply into the unique characteristics and challenges associated with each position. So firstborns often are seen as leaders and paragons of responsibility. They face significant pressures and expectations, where the middle children, they're often termed as the peacemakers. They're skillfully navigating the complexities of sibling relationships, developing strong negotiation skills. And then we go on to the youngest, and the youngest child is characterized by their charm and their attention-seeking behavior. And they also face their own unique set of dynamics, for sure. And then the only children, and similar in some ways to the firstborns, they often show traits of perfectionism and maturity due to their close relationships with their parents. And I'm going to work in a story. My sister is 5 years younger than me, as I shared. And you had 6 years on your own, Ron. I had 5 years on my own. When my sister came along, I was not happy. And my mom just this weekend, because we were all together on a road trip, she shared that she had my sister and she was like a little tiny baby, and she had put her in my doll bed. And one of her best friends was over and she was like, "Look how cute she is, yada, yada." She had her in my doll bed. Apparently I squatted over her and farted in her face. And my mom was so embarrassed. But that was one of many ways of me telling my parents, I am not happy that I now have competition here.
Wow.
On that note,
I think some serial killers did stuff like that. I'm not sure. A little bit opposite. I was thrilled to get my little sister. But keep in mind, we didn't mention this, but there's gender dynamics that come into play here. We are going to cover that in a little bit, but I do wonder if the fact I had a little sister versus you having a little sister made a difference.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. I always wanted a brother. So I could see, the dynamic's totally different. And earlier you mentioned your sister was almost like envious of your freedom.
Yeah.
The gender also has a lot to do with it because, the truth is that women and young children, but women and girls are victimized and victims way more often than boys are, right? And so as parents, we have to navigate, as you know, you have 2 daughters. We have to navigate it differently. A boy's going to have a little more freedom.
Yeah, I think in my case, I probably was victimized more only because of bullies. Guys do face some of that type stuff with, I happen to grow up around older boys, which is never a good thing. But I think there were very traditional roles where I grew up. Like my mother, she did work at some point at a beauty shop and briefly at a post office, but basically she was home, she cooked, she did those things. And my dad, I didn't see him much, but he was the bread earner. He worked outside the home. So we had very traditional roles. And also guys were, we played sports and motorcycles and were in the woods, and girls played more traditional roles. I remember my sister playing with dolls and doing
Right.
the things like that. But she did envy some of the things that I got to do. And I can see that. But I did grow up in a very traditional role-oriented family.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Dr. Leman or Leman, I'm not sure, but also discusses various factors that can modify traditional birth order traits. Families with large age gaps, and this is what we talked about earlier, between siblings, blended families, or cultural influences can significantly alter these dynamics. By showcasing examples and exception, Leman helps readers to understand that while birth order can be influential, it's not deterministic. In other words, you're not locked into that. You might
Right.
change a lot depending on other factors.
Yeah.
Most of what I shared by Dr. Leman depends on the family unit. He explains that if siblings are born 5 or more years apart, the firstborn status gets recycled. And that's what I was trying to say with my sister.
Right. Okay.
In part, it has to do with the number of years the parents had to take care of a newborn. He further explained that firstborn characteristics might be suppressed if the firstborn has a firstborn mother and father. As a result, the firstborn may rebel and act like a lastborn, and the lastborn may take on the firstborn characteristics. Did that make sense?
Yeah, and it's why I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, oh, my dad's the youngest, my mom's the middle child, and they were both wild in their youth. So it's just really interesting. I never thought about
It really is.
my parents' birth order.
Yeah. Overall, whether we have siblings or not, the dynamics we experienced as a child tend to manifest themselves in the workplace. Many studies have shown that people would prefer to make less money and work with people they like versus making more money and working with people they dislike. What do you think about that, Kristin?
Well, it's just like, okay, I think about it like, where would you rather marry like a rich guy and have everything you want, but you're not in love, or be madly in love and get married and not have a lot of money, right? It's a very similar thing. It's like, do you want to be have this big void, but then have the fiscal piece, or have, I don't know. I just feel like people in general want to be in a pleasant environment, and the money is not worth the unhappiness. So what do you think?
No, I mean, that's obviously true. I'm still going to marry her for money next time, but I mean, I get your point.
Oh, goodness. And what's interesting, when you were speaking in one of the first paragraphs we were covering, I was thinking back on teams that I've led, and I had people that worked for me that did come from dysfunctional backgrounds, and they had shared that with me. And what rocked their world is when our team had some dysfunction in it, right? And so where for me, it's like, I know that you're not always going to have a super smooth day, but for some that did grow up with some traumas, when trauma came up at work, or anything that was considered small for someone like me came up at work, it rocked their world.
Yeah.
And it was very hard for them to manage that.
Well, you and I talked before we started recording, and I don't want to get in trouble for this, but I really could. This is definitely not across the board, but I could usually tell if someone was an only child. I had an employee that was an only child, and it was very obvious. And sometimes I could tell if employees did not have children. And what I mean by that, there's always great people, there's exceptions, but if you never have children, like when I see people saying, I don't have children, but I have a fur baby.
Oh,
I'm
right.
like, oh my God, it's hard for me to read that post because they have no clue.
Yeah.
And I told Kristin, I was talking to an employee once who said, yeah, I had a cold this weekend and I laid on the couch the whole weekend and ordered takeout. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, how does that feel when you've got a cold and you can lay on the couch? I was doing dad duties with a cold.
Yeah.
And I would almost have to be in the ICU to check out like that. So I do think that perspective can alter your approach to work a little bit. Now, don't get mad at me if you're listening and you don't have kids. Maybe you're not like this, but I did see it play out some. The only child and the people without kids.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Oh, the most interesting one for me was when I had a leader who was not a parent. That was when it was hyper aware of the fact that you could tell that they didn't have children. And that was where it really stood out to me, as the leadership roles. So I want to go into advantages in understanding birth order at work. There definitely are some. So another study, this one's from Psychology Today, is having the ability to predict someone's birth order provides you with a competitive advantage in understanding how to work with the individual. I can totally see that. So like anything, you want to know what you have coming at you. You want to know what you're working with, right? So for example, the firstborns tend to be governed by punctuality, which is actually funny because I don't think that one quite landed on me. Ron likes to take pictures of when he's in studio waiting for me.
It's only like an hour or two. It's no big deal.
Couple minutes. But structure and power, whereas the lastborn are more comfortable with ambiguity and tend to go with the flow. Neither is good nor bad, but it allows you to know how to approach your employees or these individuals at work.
Exactly.
And I want to explore some other studies. So there was one in May, June-ish, 2011. And that was an issue of Psychology Today. And the insights section covered the power of birth order, which I found really interesting. So parents tend to pour their resources into the firstborn, ensuring that they have the best life. And their IQ on average is 3 points higher than their siblings, where the middleborn, they tend to be unbiased, a little more level-headed, and their careers generally involve negotiation, which is interesting. My brother-in-law is, he does things in the psychology realm, and he's the secondborn, and he's very level-headed and calm. And anyways, so they're well suited for positions in management and politics. And the lastborn in families with 3 children typically are tender and perhaps because they've gotten babied. So that's pretty interesting.
Well, I was going to ask you this, and I was going to compare my daughters. I had 2 daughters, and they are about 5 years apart. And it's so interesting, but my oldest, Haley, followed my playbook to a T. She's got a master's degree. Like, she did everything. It wasn't like, I didn't feel like I was saying these are the 10 things you got to do, but she checked off every box.
Nice.
So Jansen, in some ways, wanted to distance herself from her sister. She's also more of a free spirit. Mm-hmm. So Jansen went all over the world doing mission work, spent 2 years in Los Angeles at the Dream Center. And I went out with
Very
them,
cool.
and it was pretty intense. Now she's back. She is finishing her degree. It's like she got a lot of that maybe out of her system. And don't get me wrong, I think she was following what she believed God wanted her to do. But now she feels like she's having to play catch up a little bit. But she definitely charted her own course. And I didn't see that a lot in the studies, but I've heard other people talk about how, that second child wants to distinguish themselves from the first child, almost like a competition. Like, I'm going to be me instead of, follow the playbook.
Right. Yeah, I can see that in my family as well, for sure. More of a rebelliousness, I would say.
Okay, let's look at a different study, but we're going to do the same breakdown. And because there's a lot of studies in this regard. Mm-hmm. So this particular study, and this is furthermore in that Psychology Today, says firstborns are perfectionists, reliable, conscientious, list makers, well-organized, natural leaders, critical, and serious. Now, I got to be honest with you, Kristin. I think, when you talked about punctuality, let me give you an example. I was not punctual as a kid. I was not punctual in college. It was all I could do to get to a class. My career, it's almost like I went in the military. It was the same type thing. You got court and you got all these different things. So it became a part of me. So I do believe some of these things developed in me because of my influences and the career path that I chose.
Right.
That
can form you for sure.
Yeah. But some of the things mentioned here, I do believe, I know this sounds arrogant, that I was a natural leader. And my sister talked about that on the phone, that I always had followers. No matter what I was doing in life, I've always had followers. So that happened. And I was critical. I wasn't totally serious. So a little bit of that stuff applies to me. Anyway, these qualities are typically attributed to mom or dad unconsciously placing the firstborn into a leadership role by saying, you're a big boy now. You have to look out for your younger brother. And my mom always told me that. Like if my sister Becky was going with me, she'd say, no, you watch out for your sister. And you do start to develop that role. You're the protector.
Right.
It just comes, it's passed down from your parents.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just thinking about something that actually drove me nuts when my parents would do that to me. Because again, this is a 5-year age gap and we were the same, we're the same gender. So there was definitely a little bit of tension there, I would say. Probably from on my end because she was just a baby, didn't know what was going on, right? It was just the change for me that I didn't appreciate. But I do remember that type of stuff, like, oh, you need to watch out, you're the oldest, you need to set the example, you shouldn't. So that grew old for me quickly when I was young.
Yeah, and I was forced. I know Becky's going to listen to this. I love you, Becky. I was forced to take my sister. It's when I joked about remember diversity, equity, and inclusion. I said I named my program Celebration because I included my sister. It doesn't mean I wanted her there. I had to include her. So there's a difference, but it was because I was older. I mean, nobody wants their little sister tagging along in certain situations. So I think it was probably natural. But anyway, if of course, when you get older, if you could go back, because she treats me like I'm her little brother instead of big brother.
Oh, that's funny.
No, it is.
It's that nurturing personality, right?
You know, Kristin, she stayed here. She and her husband stayed here. They wanted to go to the beach and stuff while I was gone to Texas because they had a break.
Oh, nice.
And I wanted to see her. She wanted to see me, but it didn't work out. But I'm saying I gave her orders, do not clean, do not do anything. But she couldn't. And I tried to clean up as best I could before she came because I'm in the middle of changing housekeepers. But she had to do, I can always tell her presence was here. And she does interior decorating and all that. But yeah, I gave her strict orders. Do not clean or straighten up anything.
You knew her well enough to know.
Yeah. So only children are very thorough, deliberate, self-motivated. We mentioned it. We're going to get into an only child here a little bit more. One more time. They're deliberate, self-motivated, black and white thinkers, fearful and cautious. Only children never have to compete with siblings for personal attention, which makes them more confident and articulate. However, they struggle with the concept of having brothers or sisters, resulting in them being self-centered. In the process of putting this together, I interviewed a preschool teacher as well. And that is exactly what the preschool teacher told me, is that you could tell a lot of times, not always, the only child has trouble sharing.
Yeah.
They don't want anyone else to play with the stuff unless they got really good parents that's instilled that into them.
Right.
And that's the main characteristics. You could tell a little bit about how somebody will protect because maybe they've got younger siblings and they're in that protection mode.
Right.
But she told me the biggest thing that stood out was the only child in the dynamics. Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. And as parents with only one child, how do you, teach them? Like, what do you take their toys away at some point and say, nope, I'm going to use that would be a difficult one to teach.
Well, I do think it happens when you have friends over, with because you can see it when they start to play with other kids.
Right.
And we all deal with that. I mean, we've all had to say, no, let her play with that. And I'll tell you the tough spot is when you have an only child come over and they're taking your kids' stuff.
Oh, right.
And you want to intervene, the little brat.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful what you say. I know there's some people shaking their head on that statement. You can be a good parent and then you have to put your kid with those other hellions. And there you go.
Oh my gosh, that's hysterical. I'm bad of judging because my kids are homeschooled and they do interact we do one day of community day when they're with 50 other kids. But it is funny because we will go to plays downtown Portland and different things like children's theater. And you can definitely tell the public school kids in
Yeah.
comparison to the homeschool kids. And I'm not saying that as a positive. I'm saying like the homeschool kids generally are listening and they're relatively quiet and they're not making a scene. And so I like to go.
Do you know what I call that?
Public school kids.
You either have McDonald's kids or Chick-fil-A kids. Anyway.
Oh my goodness. That is
So
funny.
just to end this.
I was a public school kid, just everyone.
Yeah, we know.
Just a different
Yeah, we
day.
already
Yeah,
know.
I'm sure. You're busted.
So Kristin mentioned knowing the individual's birth order gives you power. Knowledge is always power. So a lot of times an only child, you will notice that they are straight thinkers, organized, and they're big time goal setters. So sometimes you're dealing with an only child when you see someone with those characteristics. Not always again, but sometimes.
And then we have the middle child. So the middle child tends to be a mediator and is diplomatic, likes to avoid conflict, is loyal to peers, and has many friends and is generally independent. And then in the workplace, they are skilled at mediating disputes. They're willing to work things out, and they can be trusted with sensitive information, which is so huge. That was always huge for me to find that person with the steel jaw.
Yeah, that's true. And then the last born, they're typically manipulative, charming, and blame others. They're attention seekers, natural salespeople, engaging, affectionate, etc.
That is my son to a T, seriously.
I started to ask you about your kids because we haven't mentioned that very much. Your daughter's older than your son.
Yeah, she's 13. He's 10. But he is a classic younger child for sure. And then she's like a mini mommy, very nurturing and loving and patient. And he would think he's an only child, but because of the gender difference and because my daughter likes girly stuff and he likes straight up boys stuff, he's never really had to share his toys with her. So he can act like an only child sometimes.
Yeah.
But when other kids come over, I'm like, you either put it in your room or it's fair game, right? Like so anyways, but that is him to a T. That is wild.
So Kristin, I had a friend who was known to be a little overbearing and maybe a little selfish among their peers. And we were just talking one time, and of course, yours truly called him out on it. And he explained to me that he had 3 very aggressive brothers, and he said he had to fight for everything he got, from second helpings to any kind of toys. It was literally, and he was smaller and younger, so that made it very hard. And it caused me, I had a little more empathy. Like, I kind of see that. I understand that.
Right.
And of course, you gotta grow out of that. But it was an interesting concept to think that he had to fight for everything that he got. So
so naturally.
Yeah. The other characteristics, or at least in dealing with someone in the workplace, is the last born, believe it or not, they read others well and know how to work well one-on-one or in small groups. They are caring, always wanting to help, and are easy to talk to. They've kind of been that go-between. Sometimes they're the negotiator, maybe, and they do want attention, but they do seem to cooperate with others quite well.
Yeah. That it's really interesting because my son, I will give my daughter a compliment and I'll be like, your hair looks awesome today. And literally he'll go, and I'm like, yours too. It looks good. So I literally cannot compliment my daughter without my son getting offended. And so now I always just compliment them both. But then sometimes I give him a hard time. Like, all right, buddy, like I think you get enough attention. I think you're okay. So but it is interesting. Where my daughter, she really doesn't care. If I compliment him, she knows, I just feel like it's just such a different dynamic.
Let's look at some research on this topic, but let's focus on boys. The research comes from Joseph Doyle and several associates. He's an MIT economist, and he doesn't look at the positive stuff. He's looking at the negative stuff, such as violent crime, delinquency, school suspensions, etc. Now, basically, Doyle and his associates are comparing older brothers against younger brothers. Now, you can assume the family environment for both kids is more or less constant. The data comes from two very different settings, the state of Florida and the country of Denmark.
Wow.
Lots of things are different in those two places, but the researchers find consistent evidence when it comes to crime and delinquency. And I like the way they studied Florida and Denmark because it shows a broad range and they got the same finding.
Yeah, no, that's wild because you couldn't be more different, those two. So I find the results really to be remarkable that the second born children in general, compared to their older siblings, are much more likely to end up in prison and much more likely to get suspended in school, have to go to juvie. I mean, across these outcomes, we're getting 25 to 40% increases in the likelihood of these outcomes just by comparing a second-born sibling to the firstborn. That's wild to me. And the evidence shows that only 1 in 20 are getting in serious trouble. But Doyle, he is saying that among this minority of children, there appears to be sizable differences between the first and second-born brothers.
Yeah, this was probably, I had an aha moment. And that was it when I started reading that. And I should know that. I mean, that was my world, criminal justice. I did not remember that. So why is this the case? Well, one possible explanation has to do with the effect of parental time and investment. As many other earlier studies have noted, firstborn kids get the undivided attention of their parents, whereas kids born later are often competing for parental time and resources. Another factor that might be different is the peer group for first and second born kids is different. Older and younger siblings come from the same family, but they have a different peer group in their early life.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I was just, as you were talking about this, I was just thinking my sister told a story this weekend. And again, she's the second born. And when my mom had me, she took time off and like a good year or two off, right? And was not working in her career. Now, it wasn't the same when she had my sister. My sister got like maybe a 2-3 month maternity leave. And then she was, back to babysitter daycare type of situation. So when it comes to our experiences, they're quite different. And my sister was talking the other day on our road trip, and she was like, yeah, I remember just wanting to hang out with you, Mom. And we would end up going to the mall, and then you'd see a friend, and then you'd be talking for hours. And me, I was mouthy, so I would have said, this is annoying. Come on. You told me we were going to do X. Let's go do X, right? But she would sit and just ingest it. And my mom was like, I'm sorry, right? But it's interesting. Here we are. She's in her late 30s. I'm in my early 40s. And we have these things that still have impacted at some level, right? All these years later. So I definitely see it even now. Yeah. And, going back to the firstborn has role models who are adults, right? Mm-hmm. It's so different. And I think my daughter, she got 5 years with me and my husband alone, right? Same with me. So I'm sorry, my daughter got 3.5 years, but it was, she was around adults all the time. And, the second later born children, I just think of even, my son, we ended up hiring a nanny. And so my son didn't have as much parent time as my daughter had. So it's just very different. So both the parental investments are different, and the sibling influences probably contribute to these differences that we see in the labor market and that we find in delinquency. So it's just very different to separate those two things because they happen at the same time.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that your daughter's role models you, and possibly your sons, especially if there's more than one sibling, is like a 2-year-old. That's who they're watching, or a 5-year-old.
Right.
So, it makes a difference.
It does.
Before people get too upset, this is very controversial. But what happens is everyone thinks of, as we said, their own family dynamics, or that Ozzie and Harriet that we talked about. And of course, this research paints a broad picture. We're not saying that this applies in every situation, but be careful that you judge things for what it is instead of what you want it to be or what it has been. So, Kristin, after all of this, any final thoughts?
Oh my goodness. It just reinforces what I already feel like I had a good understanding of. But you know what's different is I had never really thought of it tying back to the workplace, right? So that's where it really resonated with me is how it plays out in the birthplace, not just in your home life.
Yeah, we often say knowledge is power, and understanding personality characteristics, how someone communicates, their social upbringing, things like that are important, but also birth order can play a part in that. And, I tell leaders, I said this last week, get a PhD in you and a master's degree in your staff. And if you learn more about your staff, you can be more effective in your coaching and your organization is going to be stronger. It's as simple as that. So,
yeah,
man, I found this interesting. There was definitely some things I didn't know, and I thought it was a really cool episode. I'm glad we did this, Kristin.
Yeah, same here.
And thanks for the cool T-shirt you made on your cricket. And
You're welcome.
There's a lot of people wanting these, so we're going to be announcing something pretty soon.
Once we get enough interest, I don't be able to be weaving the vinyl, so we'll have to place an order.
Yep.
But yes, let us know if you're liking them.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.